I'm Dr. Joseph MT, Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. This is the e-Pathshala project for religion and society, and we are now in module 34. In this module, we look at consuming religion in the 21st century. We begin this module by asking the question, what is specific about 21st century? And this module very specifically would look at economic changes and how these economic changes have brought kind of consequences in our other realms of society, in our case very specifically religion. One of the things that are standing out as very specific to 21st century is what we call neoliberalism or hyper-capitalism. Neoliberalism and hyper-capitalism are connected to what we call things like Washington Consensus and the ways that certain international financial institutions are dictating policies, economic policies to governments. Now this has given rise to growth of major multinational corporations, and governments today are actually looking at facilitating the work and the spread of these multinational corporations across the world. And therefore we are in an era of a very different, qualitatively different economic order of neoliberalism. Now the question is, how does this neoliberalism impinge on or influence the realm of religion or the domain of religion? And one of the ways in which this has actually impinged religion is by what we can call the idea or the practice of conspicuous consumption. Religion becomes something to be consumed, and in that sense religion becomes something to be positioned as a product that can be consumed, and the practice and the propagation and the experience of religion itself gets in that sense part of the neoliberal logic. These days, for example, some sociologists of religion use the theories of demand side and supply side religion to refer to the religious movements and religious practices and religious developments that are happening in different parts of the world. That theories like the rational choice theory, which are from a very clearly economic point of view, can be applied to the sociology of religion, shows the way that in the 21st century the economic aspect of life is very heavily influencing other areas of life, especially religion and culture. And we look at the way that consumption, and we look at in this module the consumption practices of religions, especially in the context of India today. These are the kind of issues that we shall be discussing in this module. 21st century is marked by some gigantic social changes in the world, like rise of global economy accentuated by hyper-capitalism, and neoliberalism, which is more global, more entrenched and more exploitative. The third world countries are competing rigorously in the global market, and many of these, like China, has successfully carved out a niche in the global market. Industrialization has led to rapid rise of brick economies, which give competition to an American-led hegemony in the world. Besides, the advent of neoliberal culture increased the power of private corporate. We experienced a tremendous growth in the digital telecommunication market and cheaper availability of technology. The deepening global concerns about the burgeoning inequality in the 21st century are vocal in many writings. Piketty shows that a number of the dollar billionaires has risen tenfold times from 140 in late 80s to 1,400 by 2010. P. Sainath says that in recent times, almost everything an upper middle professional world would own has become drastically cheaper, from mobile phones, computer sets, air conditioners, flight tickets to cars. But for marginalized like a domestic help in his house, the basic necessities like rice, electricity and water became 300 to 600% more expensive. The distribution of modern technology is also not uniform. For about 20% of the world's population in 2012 still lacked access to electric power, with many more having only intermittent and poor access. Neoliberalism and religious consumerism. The prime motive behind the adoption of neoliberal policies was the removal of class inequality by freeing market and trade from state intervention. However, we observe the disparity between ideology and neoliberalism and the practice of neoliberalism. Transformationalists or radicals look at the epochal changes with the coming of neoliberal capitalism of the 21st century. There is a continuing shift in focus from production to consumption at an unprecedented level. Appadurai talks of the fetish of the consumer. Agency and choice of consumer is an interesting point he flags off. He argues that agency is falsely assumed by the consumer, who is in fact merely a commodified a pawn that is identified and manipulated by the producer and the production process. Appadurai then cites global advertising as a medium which has driven people to consume us. So are we buying products because we actually want them, or are we simply playing into the production scheme to maximize the producer's profits? It is pertinent that we look into the commodification of religion and how religious industry is commercialized. Jeremy Carrett and Richard King argue convincingly that a consumer capitalist mentality has thoroughly penetrated the world religions. On the similar lines, York also says that in the present age where flow of information is taking place at an enormous speed, the rate of religious consumerism has also been accelerated. There is an upsurge of religious mass industry, a phenomenon exclusive to industrialization and neoliberal globalized economy. Here, thought of Frankfurt School, especially Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno, needs a special mention because both look at the mass industrial productivity with a critical lens. Benjamin argues that with the possibility of mechanical production of art forms like Mona Lisa painting, the art loses its authority and authenticity, which he famously calls the aura of art. The art object is also severed from the domain of tradition. For instance, he says that the statues of Venus for Greeks was a ceremonial object destined to serve in a cult. But when art came to be mediated by technology, being a statue lost its aura. Similarly, we can argue that mechanical reproduction of artistic religious objects in the 21st century has impacted people's modes of reception and consumption pattern. The markets are flooded with religious commodities on the eve of Christmas, Diwali, Eid al-Fitr and so on. Has it also disconnected us from the aura of religion, or is it simply heading towards democratization of cultural production of religious objects? Benjamin would say, although mechanical reproduction of religious art democratizes cultural production as it becomes available to people from all sections of society, but its authenticity ceases to be applicable. Adorno, on the other hand, would argue against the commercial character of cultural products. When religious forms become a commodity to be sold in the market, its essence is commercially exploited. The work of creation turns out to be an event of consumption, consecrated through fashion and media advertisements. The role of state towards inseminating religion. When we talk about neoliberalism and globalization in the 21st century, we should not talk about it just as in pure economic terms. As mentioned earlier, functioning of an economy cannot be understood disassociated from the social and cultural world in which it is embedded. This idea was first propounded by Karl Polanyi, who took a substantivist approach and explained how economic institutions or organizations are ultimately the economy as a whole need to be understood as parts of larger, historically derived social structures. In this way, we argue that the relationship between the cultural ethics of ascetic Protestantism and the emergence of the modern capitalism, as Max Weber has argued, holds relevance here. The state's topmost priority under the regime of neoliberal globalization is to facilitate smooth running of the markets. Meerananda talks about state-temple corporate complex whereby private companies and religious leaders in collaboration with the government enter into the profit maximization endeavor. For instance, the newly invented rituals like gold car in temples of Tamil Nadu and the reenactment of Shiva and Parvati wedding are simply money-making processes by befalling the devotees. Such endeavors are carried out with the assistance of the government, which is also in a way trying to consolidate a particular belief system. To abide by a particular religion in the 21st century should also be seen in the light of state-sponsored idea of religion. State may clandestinely reinforce a particular belief system through education or other means. For instance, Nanda reports how the previous BJP administration, the UGC, had approved BA and even MA and PhD level courses in subjects like Vedic astrology and had pushed for courses in Vastu Shastra and Karma Kanda. Section 3. Religion and Globalization. The central problem of the global interactions of the 21st century is the tension between cultural homogenization and cultural heterogenization. Appadurai argues that these arguments fail to consider is that the process of indigenization is also possible when various metropolises are brought into new societies. For instance, Japanization for Koreans or Indianization for Sri Lankans. Another example could be Toba Batak, a tribal clan in Sumatra has adopted Hinduism. The ethnic groups in mainland and insular Southeast Asia have been exposed to relatively intensive Indian cultural influences. Therefore, Indianization of Southeast Asian cultures is a process of indigenization. To further illustrate with religious examples, Caribbean Pentecostal churches, Nigerian Aladura churches, or branches of the Zimbabwe Assemblies of God, Africa, in Britain and Ghanaian Pentecostal churches are also different from any British religious institution. The new global cultural economy, therefore, has to be understood as a complex disjunctive order. Appadurai, therefore, proposes a framework for exploring the relationship between 5 dimensions of global culture. The first is ethnoscape, which is constituted by tourists, immigrants, exiles, guest workers, or refugees who appear to affect the politics of nations. This is not confused with migration, which happened earlier too. The people in the 21st century could move and migrate as a consequence of shifts in the needs of international capital, technology, or governmental policies. A transfer of culture and customs across borders is possible by ethnoscapes. The second is technoscape, which means the movement of mechanical and international technology across the borders and the ability of such technology to move at rapid speeds. This is due to the technology which is able to maneuver the physical boundaries. Technoscapes bring about new types of on-cultural interactions and exchanges, and through the power of technology, it may also lead to revivalism and fortification of religion. In this respect, Brian Turner states this. Islamic revivalism in Asia is related to the improvement in the transportation that allowed many Muslims to travel to Mecca and return with reformist ideas. Financescape means that rapid functioning of currency markets and national stock exchanges. The movement of money is so mysteriously fast that it is now difficult to follow it than even before. Mediascapes refer both to the distribution of these electronic capabilities to produce and disseminate information in the form of newspapers, TV films, etc. It allows distant cultures to view each other. It might create an image of a distant culture that could be skewed or narrow-sighted. For instance, we see an expansion of TV channels in India like Astha, Sanskar, MH1, Shraddha, Bhakti TV and Godesha, which are purely religious channels. Lastly, ideoscapes are also series of images, but they are often political and frequently have to do with ideologies of states and counter-ideologies, socio-religious political movements. These include ideas, terms and images including freedom, welfare, rights, sovereignty and democracy. The globalization of religion in the 20th century has strong connections with the evolution of a global business ethic and global corporations. Lehman says that the interaction of religion and globalization seems to change boundaries in 2 ways. One, which he calls cosmopolitan, brings all practices to new groups and new settings, a variant of disembedding. For instance, shaping the Eastern religion outside Asia in the form of transcendental meditation, yogic breathing and practices, and etc. The other variant, which he calls global, extends and intensifies multinational links among groups similar in their own practices and creates tightly knit communities of people. For instance, Pentecostals, the Pietist Muslim Revival Movement, Tablighi Jamaat, and the ultra-Orthodox Jewish sects and cultures. With the kind of developments that are listed above, we shall now place the role of religion in the 21st century and how it has been influenced by global economic changes. Fengang Yang, in his study, illustrates the impacts of market globalization and political repression upon converts in urban China. He gives examples from the life history of 3 interviewees who had bitter experiences in the market and the business but saved with conversion to Christianity. The religion offered their peace, a sense of individual freedom, civility, responsibility and status in urban China. Christianity became accessible during the process of China's market transition and global integration. Filippo Osella and Caroline Osella study articulations between politico-religious orientations and economic practice of the contemporary forms of capital accumulation among the Muslims of Kerala and Gulf. The influence of globalization evident in the ways Muslims negotiate with their morals, as we can also think about the ways in which Islam may have come to permeate capitalism. But these processes are not linear progressions, nor do they have stable outcomes. When we argue for the changing consumption patterns of religion in the 21st century, an interesting academic piece written by Sanjay Srivastava holds relevance here. He talks about 300 million man-hours by some 11,000 volunteers, artisans and sadhus who contributed towards the construction of the Akshardham temple situated in New Delhi. The temple radiates extravagance and opulence, an attempt to realign religious practice to the needs of new cultural and economic environment. He says that Akshardham embodies a number of separate processes that are collapsed into making of a new culture of consumption and urban space. Secondly, he sees this new urban space as one part of a broader process of latest urban developments that point towards the idea of becoming middle class through certain practices of residence and housing. This is because, as Zubkin also records, that the visitors of Akshardham complex are not from the upper middle class but the non-English speaking workers. Surplus consumption unfolds in a number of ways inside the temple, as there are eating joints at the food hall and well-stocked Akshardham shop which sells a wide variety of religious commodities. So one consumes a wide variety of products of contemporary capitalism: IMAX cinema, the Disney boat ride, etc. Akshardham baseball caps, in combination with religious goods like calendars, diaries, audio, video, cassettes, books, t-shirts, keychains, and 3D images of the deities. Srivastava says that here the refashioning of the urban space tells us something about ideas of a different kind of middle classness and their perceived relationship to consumption practices. This, he says, constitutes a narrative of the imagined relationship between space and identity. Akshardham represents what Rajiv Kishore, headmaster of the private school in Srivastava's work, says is a different kind of Hinduism, one that is clean as well as global. In this module, we have looked at how religion and consumption are related. Now, when we talk about consumption, usually we don't think about religion because we look at religion from a very different point of view. There is a conservative kind of an imagination in our mind which thinks about religion as not related to words and practices like consumption. But as we have seen in this module, the developments that have happened in the world in the last 50 years in terms of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism is actually affecting all areas of life have brought both the realms of religion and the practice of consumption in a very curious kind of a mixture. And what does this mixture hold for any of us, all of us in India, as we analyze the interface between religion and society? That is what we have looked at in this module. Thank you.